The familiar voice of Mrs. Martinez, the owner of the corner grocery store, rang out from behind. Sarah stopped and turned to look at the older woman waving at her from the store doorway. "Come in here for a moment," Mrs. Martinez called, her voice warm and full of concern. "I have something for you." Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to be late for work, but Mrs. Martinez had become one of her few friends over the past months. Every morning, she would greet her as she passed the store, sometimes even giving her a cup of hot coffee or a cookie. "I can't stay long," Sarah said as she entered the warm store. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and fresh pastries filled her mouth with saliva. I know," Mrs. Martinez smiled, handing Sarah a small paper bag. "But I can't let you walk around in this cold with nothing in your stomach. There's a chicken sandwich and a bottle of water. And don't worry about the money. This is my gift." Sarah felt her eyes sting. This simple kindness, these small acts of kindness, are sometimes more difficult to accept than the difficulties. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Mrs. Martinez patted Sarah's shoulder. "Just promise me you'll stay warm and eat well. I don't like seeing you getting thinner day by day like this." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice at the moment. She clutched the bag of food to her chest and walked out, the doorbell ringing softly behind her. As she continued her journey, the sunlight rose higher, illuminating golden streaks of light on the steel and glass buildings. The air was still cold, but somehow it didn't seem to cut into my skin like before. Perhaps it was the warmth from the bag of bread, or perhaps it was the warmth of kindness. Sarah didn't notice the patrol car slowly following her. Initially, it was just one of the rare cars on the road at this early hour. But after about 10 minutes, she began to notice that it was always there, about half a block away from her, moving at a speed that matched her walk. Her heart beat faster. She had heard stories of women being followed, of terrible things that could happen in the lonely hours of dawn. She tried to walk faster, her aching feet protesting each step. The patrol car also sped up. Sarah felt a cold sweat run down her spine despite the morning chill. She could run, but how far? And with these worn shoes, how long can she run? The patrol car's lights turned on. Sarah stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned around, preparing. She didn't know what to prepare for. Run? Yelling? Cry? The car door opened, and a female police officer stepped out. She had neatly tied brown hair and a kind face that was nothing like Sarah imagined her stalker would look like. "Hello," the policeman said, his voice gentle and professional. "I'm Officer Rodriguez. I observed you walking a long distance. Are you okay?" Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, but remained alert. "Yeah, I'm fine. I was just walking to work." Officer Rodriguez looked down at Sarah's worn shoes, then up at her tired face. "How far are you going?" "About 20 miles. The policewoman's eyes opened wide. 20 miles? Every day? Sarah nodded, feeling her cheeks heat up with embarrassment. "My car broke down, and I don't have money to fix it. I need to go to work." "And there's no bus?" "The nearest bus route is 5 miles from my house, and it doesn't run at this hour." Officer Rodriguez was silent for a moment, his eyes full of thought. "How long have you been doing this?" 3 months. "In this weather?" The policewoman's voice was filled with surprise and something like admiration. Sarah shrugged. "I have no other choice. My mother is sick and needs medicine. I can't lose my job." Officer Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if making an important decision. Let me take you. No, there's no need, Sarah quickly protested. I'm used to it. I can't let you walk 20 miles in this weather, Officer Rodriguez said firmly yet gently. Plus, I wanted to talk to you about some support programs the city has. Maybe we can figure out a way to help you and your mother. Sarah stood there, feeling tears welling up again. But this time, it wasn't because of fatigue or despair. Those were tears of hope, a feeling she thought she had long forgotten. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked. You're welcome, Officer Rodriguez smiled, opening the car door. This is my job, to help people. And you, Sarah, you deserve help. As Sarah sat in the back seat of the patrol car, for the first time in 3 months, she felt her legs no longer ached. Or maybe she just didn't pay attention to the pain anymore. Because sometimes, an act of kindness can heal not only physical wounds, but also emotional wounds. Through the car window, Sarah saw the sun had risen, shining brightly on the city. A new day was beginning, and for the first time in a long time, she felt it brought with it glimmers of hope. In her coat pocket, Mrs. Martinez's sandwich was still warm. And somehow, it's not just a meal anymore. It's a reminder that, in this world, no matter how cold and difficult it is, there are always people willing to warm our hearts with their actions. Smallness of kindness. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the tears silently roll down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't tears of pain or despair. They are tears of gratitude, of hope, and of faith, that even in the darkest of times, light can still find its way to us. The patrol car glided quietly into the dawn light, and with it, a new story began to be written. A story not only of resilience and sacrifice, but also of humanity and miracles. Small things happen every day if we just open our hearts to receive them. When the patrol car stopped in front of the garment factory, Sarah realized she still had 20 minutes before her shift started, something that had never happened in the past 3 months. Normally, she would have just arrived, panting and exhausted from the long journey. I can wait until you get inside, Officer Rodriguez said, turning off the car's engine. But before that, I want to talk to you for a bit, if you don't mind. Sarah nodded, still feeling a little embarrassed. In the light of day, inside the warm patrol car, her difficulties seemed clearer than ever. You know, Officer Rodriguez began, turning so he could look directly at Sarah. I've been working in this area for 5 years. I see all kinds of people, all kinds of stories. But you're the first person I've ever seen walk 20 miles every day just to get to work. Sarah bowed her head, looking down at her hands. I don't want others to pity me. No one feels sorry for you, Officer Rodriguez interrupted. On the contrary, yes. What you're doing, it shows an extraordinary strength. But you know, sometimes real strength isn't about taking on everything yourself. Sometimes it's about knowing when to accept help. Those words touched something deep within Sarah. She felt the wall she had built around her over the past months begin to crack. My mother, she began, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. She has terminal breast cancer. The doctors say she only has a few months left. We don't have insurance. The medicine is very expensive. I can't. Her voice broke. Officer Rodriguez reached out and gently took Sarah's hand. I have an older sister, the female police officer said after a moment of silence. She's been through the same thing, and I know there are support programs that can help you and your mother. Non-profit organizations, cancer foundations. You don't have to fight. Fight alone. Sarah looked up, tears sparkling in her eyes. Really? Really? Officer Rodriguez smiled. And that's just the beginning. I also know of a city program that helps repair cars for low-income people. They have volunteers who are retired mechanics who want to help the community. Maybe they can look at your car. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a real glimmer of hope. Not the fragile kind of hope she told herself every morning when she started her journey, but something more solid, more real. Why? Sarah hesitated. Why did you help me like that? Officer Rodriguez was silent for a moment, as if considering his answer. Because it was the right thing to do, she said finally. And because I believe that in this world, we need to care more for each other. Each of us can be a light in someone else's darkness. Sarah looked out the window, where her colleagues were milling about entering the factory. They looked so ordinary, each carrying their own burden. She wondered how many of them were also fighting alone, like she had been. I don't know where to start, Sarah admitted. You don't have to know, Officer Rodriguez said. That's why I'm here. I'll help you. But first, she took out a business card and a piece of paper. Here's my phone number and the address of the Community Support Center. They're open at 9 a.m. After your shift, I can pick you up and take you there. We'll get started. Start with the simplest things first. Sarah took the card, feeling it feel heavy in her hand, not because of its physical weight, but because of its meaning. This isn't just a piece of paper with a phone number. It was a thread that connected her to hope, to the possibility of a different future. Thank you, she said, and this time, words didn't seem enough to express what she felt. Don't thank me, Officer Rodriguez shook his head. Just promise me one thing. From now on, you won't go alone anymore, okay? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to say anything else. As she stepped out of the car and into the factory, Sarah could feel Officer Rodriguez's eyes following her until she was safely inside. It wasn't a look of pity or judgment, but of sincere concern, something she had forgotten what it felt like. During her shift that day, Sarah noticed that her legs no longer ached like usual. Perhaps not because she didn't have to walk, but because the burden on her heart was much lighter. She no longer felt like she was fighting alone. And when she looked down at the business card in her pocket, Sarah knew her life was about to change. Not in a magical or sudden way, but in small steps. Each act of kindness, each moment of hope. Outside the factory windows, snow began to fall lightly, covering the city with a layer of pure white. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah was no longer afraid of the cold. Because she learned that on the coldest winter days, sometimes human love can be the warmest fire. A week after her encounter with Officer Rodriguez, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom, staring at the reflection of her face. Something has changed. Not physically. She still has dark circles under her eyes. Her skin is still pale from lack of sleep and prolonged stress. But in those eyes, a ray of light had returned. Sarah? Her mother's weak voice echoed from the next room. Are you ready? Yes, Mom, Sarah replied, tugging harder on her old sweater. Today was a special day, their first day at the community cancer center that Officer Rodriguez had introduced them to. Sarah walked into her mother's room, where she was sitting on the bed, leaning against old pillows. Margaret Thompson has lost a lot of weight over the past months. Her face is gaunt, and her hair is thinning, but her eyes still light up every time she sees her daughter. What do you think about this shirt? Margaret asked, pointing to the light purple sweater she was wearing, the last birthday gift from her husband before he died in an accident 3 years ago. Sarah swallowed. It's very beautiful, Mom. Purple suits you very well. Car horns sounded from outside. Officer Rodriguez had arrived, as promised. Over the past week, she has not only driven Sarah to work, but also helped them fill out applications for support programs, schedule appointments with the cancer center, and even contacted a local garage. Towards Sarah's car. "Let me help you," Sarah said, gently placing her hand under her mother's arm. Margaret stood up slowly, her weak body shaking with each movement. When they got to the door, Officer Rodriguez was waiting with his personal vehicle, an older model blue Subaru. "Good morning," she smiled warmly. "Let me help Mrs. Thompson." Sarah watched as Officer Rodriguez gently helped her mother into the back seat, adding a small pillow behind her back. Small, caring gestures like this caused a lump in Sarah's throat. On the way to the cancer center, Sarah looked out the window, observing the city of Denver in the morning sunlight. The roads she had walked over the past 3 months looked different now. No longer endless miles of loneliness and fatigue, but part of a journey that led to hope. "Sarah," Officer Rodriguez broke the silence. "I have good news to share. Mike at the garage said your car only needs a small electrical system replacement. He can fix it. It at a very low cost through the city's support program." Sarah felt her heart jump. "Really? How much?" "About $100, Officer Rodriguez said, "and they allow installment payments." From the back seat, Margaret coughed lightly. "Officer Rodriguez, I don't know how to thank you." "Please call me Maria," Officer Rodriguez interrupted with a warm smile. "And don't thank me. This is what we should do for each other. Help when we can." When they arrived at the cancer center, Sarah was surprised by how cozy the place was. There are no cold white walls or the strong smell of antiseptic like in a hospital. Instead, there are walls painted in soft pastel colors, vibrant paintings, and the gentle scent of fresh flowers. A nurse named Lisa greeted them at the reception desk with a friendly smile. "Mrs. Thompson, we've been waiting for you. Dr. Stevens will see you in 15 minutes. In the meantime, I can introduce you to our support programs." As Lisa led them through the hallways, she explained about emotional support groups, free nutritional counseling sessions, and even gentle yoga classes for patients. "We believe that treatment is not just about medicine," she said, "but it's also about comprehensive care for both body and mind." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand as they sat down in the cozy waiting room. On the wall, a large board displays photos of patients who have been and are being treated here. Smiling faces, eyes full of hope. "You know," Margaret whispered, looking at the photos, "this is the first time I feel like I'm not alone in this fight." Sarah said nothing, just hugged her mother tightly. She knew exactly that feeling. The feeling of finally realizing that you don't have to fight alone. Officer Rodriguez, Maria, sat on the other side of the waiting room, quietly observing the mother and daughter with warm eyes. She did more than what a police officer should have done. She became a friend, a guardian angel, a ray of light in the darkness. And when Dr. Stevens appeared, a middle-aged man with a kind smile and understanding eyes, Sarah knew they had found not just hope, but a new family. A family is created not by blood, but by kindness, care, and humanity. Sarah Thompson lifted her tired feet and walked down the cold sidewalk in the dim dawn of Denver. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold February air. 3 months have passed since her old car finally stopped working, and since then, she has had no choice but to walk to the garment factory, where she works the night shift. 20 miles, 40,000 steps, every day. Sarah pulled her worn coat tight, trying to stay warm in the bitter cold. The cheap sneakers had begun to puncture their soles, revealing small cracks that allowed moisture and cold to seep in. but she couldn't afford a new pair of shoes. Not when every penny of her savings had to be spent on caring for her ailing mother. The first rays of dawn began to filter through high-rise buildings, creating long streaks of light on the frost-covered road surface. Sarah could hear the sound of car engines in the distance, the city slowly waking up. But here, on the deserted streets of the old industrial park, only the sound of her footsteps echoed on the concrete. The smell of a nearby bakery wafted through her nose, sweet, toasted butter and fresh yeast. Sarah's stomach growled, but she ignored it. Her breakfast is an apple and half a granola bar left over from yesterday. She must save money. Every dollar matters. Sarah! 6 months had passed since Sarah met Officer Rodriguez on that 20-mile road. Denver's harsh winter has given way to a warm spring, and with the changes in weather, Sarah's life has changed dramatically. This morning, when Sarah drove her repaired car to the garment factory, she stopped at Mrs. Martinez's grocery store as usual. But this time, it's not to receive a bag of charity food, it's to share good news. "Mrs. Martinez!" Sarah called out as she entered the store, the familiar bell ringing. "Your mom finished her first round of chemotherapy." Mrs. Martinez stepped out from behind the counter, wrapping her arms tightly around Sarah. "Oh, daughter, that's wonderful news. I know Margaret is strong, just like you." Sarah smiled, feeling tears of happiness well up in her eyes. "The doctors say that Mom is responding very well to treatment. And..." She hesitated for a moment. "I want to thank you. If it weren't for the breakfasts you gave me on difficult days that..." "Shh," Mrs. Martinez put a finger to her lips. "That's what anyone would do. Now tell me more about your mother." Sarah sat down in her familiar chair by the counter, which had now become her favorite stop every morning. She talked about her treatment sessions at the cancer center, about the emotional support group her mother attended, about how Maria, Officer Rodriguez, still visited them regularly. "You know," Mrs. Martinez said when Sarah finished the story, "sometimes the worst things bring out the best things. Just like seeds have to go through a harsh winter before they can germinate in its spring." Sarah nodded, thinking about all the changes in the past 6 months. Her car was repaired thanks to the city's assistance program. Her mother is being treated at a greatly reduced cost through a cancer patient support fund. And most importantly, they are no longer alone. "Sarah!" A familiar voice rang out from the shop. Maria Rodriguez walked in, still in her police uniform, but with a bright smile on her face. "Maria! Don't you have to work?" "On patrol," Maria laughed. "But I heard about your mother from the center. I had to stop by to congratulate her." Mrs. Martinez quickly poured 3 cups of coffee, and they sat there, in a cozy little corner of the grocery store, sharing joy and hope. Sarah looked at the 2 women before her, one who gave her food when she was hungry, the other who gave her hope when she was desperate, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "I have an idea," Maria said suddenly. "We should have a small party to celebrate this good news. I know a great Mexican restaurant." "Oh no," Mrs. Martinez interjected. "We'll have it here. She'll cook her best dishes. And Margaret has to come. She needs to get out more." Sarah felt the tears well up again. "You don't have to." "Shh," both Maria and Mrs. Martinez said in unison, causing all 3 to laugh. "Daughter," Mrs. Martinez said gently, "this is not something we have to do. This is something we want to do. Because that is what community, what family means." Sarah looked out the window, where the spring sunlight was shining on the street. The street that just 6 months ago she had walked in despair. Now everything seems to shine with a new beauty. Not because the world has changed, but because she has learned to see it through the lens of hope and humanity. That afternoon, when Sarah drove to pick up her mother from therapy, she told her about the party plans. Margaret listened with teary eyes. "You know," she said, her voice gentle, "I've always prayed for God to send an angel to help us. I didn't expect he would send a whole army of angels." Sarah smiled, thinking about Maria Rodriguez in her police uniform, about Mrs. Martinez with her breakfast bags, about Lisa and the medical team at the cancer center, about the mechanics who fixed her car with her cheap price. They are all angels in their own way, not with wings and halos, but with acts of kindness and open hearts. When they arrived home, Sarah stopped on the porch and looked up at the clear spring sky. She remembered the lonely footsteps on the 20-mile road, remembered the feeling of despair and exhaustion. But now, she understands that sometimes the longest road is not the road we take with our feet, but the road we take with our heart, the road from fear to hope, from loneliness to love, love from despair to faith. "Let's go home, Mom," Sarah said, helping Margaret out of the car. And for the first time in a long time, the word home is no longer just a place, but a feeling. The feeling of being surrounded by love, held by kind hands, and warmed by the fire of hope. Because in the end, Sarah learned that in this life, we never really have to go it alone. There are always people willing to go with us, if we are brave enough to open our hearts to receive them. And sometimes, the most magical thing isn't finding your way home, but realizing that home is wherever there is love.